Okay, guys, let's get started here. Welcome to Making Sense of Deck Stains and Finishes. I'm Justin Fink. I'm Editorial Director of Fine Homebuilding. And today we're going to be talking about deck stains and protective finishes, specifically for wood decking, obviously. If you have a synthetic decking, you are probably in the wrong presentation, and you should not be putting clear coats and deck stains on your synthetic deck. So likely you're here for this presentation because you need to refinish your own deck, or you build decks for other people, or you're just having trouble falling asleep and need my help. Just kidding. This stuff is interesting, and I think you'll find it helpful. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So you guys all know you can type questions in as we go, but I'm likely going to plow ahead and then answer them at the end, unless there are any opportune moments as I'm moving through the information. We're also recording the presentation, and we're going to post it on our site afterwards. So don't worry if you miss something. We can always go back, and there will be a comment section below that video posted on our site for further discussion. Okay, so let's get started here. First things first, some species of wood deck planks will last for many years outside without any finish. But the results are not going to be pretty. What we're up against here is sunlight and moisture, and those are going to turn the unprotected wood into something gray, checked, and fuzzy on the surface. So for those of us with wood decks, which by the way is still the majority of decks being built, so don't let the wave of synthetics fool you. For those of us with wood decks, choosing the right protective finish is going to be the most important part of the process. You'd think that it wouldn't be too hard. Well, then you take a quick walk down the paint aisle at the home center, and you're going to quickly change your mind on that. Because to be fair, some manufacturers will still take mercy on the consumer who's used to seeing labels that might just say oil-based and water-based deck stain. But we also now have alkyd, acrylic, among other things that we're going to get into. There are cans that say penetrating oil formula. But then on the back of the product, it'll say it's cleaned up with soap and water. I even saw one exterior stain product a while back labeled as oil latex. In some cases, you're going to see a complicated string of buzzwords. I'm not going to name names here, no product names, but I've seen one called Premium Wood-Toned Weatherproofing Wood Finish, and another, which is my personal favorite of all, is the product called Wood Protector Toner Waterproofing Sealant. Yes, that's an actual product name. I'm not sure if they still make it. Hopefully they change the name if they do still make it. But formulation aside, you also then have to choose the level of opacity, you know, how clear the finish is. And this is going to range from water clear to opaque, like paint. And it has various shades in between, each offering its own contribution to durability. So in short, exterior deck finishes market is super complicated. But once you sort through the options, there are fundamental differences that separate one finish from the next in terms of application, durability, and cost. And the hope today is that we're going to walk you through and give you the information so that you can make a better choice when you're out there shopping. What I won't do is tell you what brand or type of product to buy. That is up to you, and it really does vary based on a lot of factors. But I can teach you how to shop and how to choose. So let's dig in and we'll get started. All right, so first things first, we're going to talk about what we're up against, and that is sunlight and water. Besides enhancing a deck's aesthetic appeal, the protective finish really has to defend against these two things. And you make no mistake here, because these two elements are among the most destructive forces that Mother Nature has in her arsenal, and in many climates, they're at work on a day-to-day basis. So let's start with sunlight. When someone talks about being damaged by sunlight, what they're really talking about is damage from ultraviolet or UV rays. Wood is essentially a combination of cellulose fibers and lignin. And lignin is like the glue that holds together those wood fibers. When UV light hits the boards, it tends to break down and destroy lignin. And after that happens, the cellulose fibers loosen and they can wear away. So it's like destroying the glue that's holding everything together. This exposes a fresh layer of fibers and lignin, and the process repeats and repeats. So to be effective, the deck finish either has to reflect or absorb that harmful UV light. Those are really the only two choices. But here's the catch. The protection we use, which is a coat of deck finish, either sits in the top layer of the wood, where it's susceptible to the protection we use, which is a coat of deck finish, whether it's a penetrating finish or a film forming finish, it's going to sit in the top layer of the wood where it's susceptible to wear and tear. And the reason why I say it can be either penetrating or film forming is that even when it's penetrating, it's really not penetrating that deep. If we're talking about something like a tung oil, it's only going to soak so far into the wood. It's still going to be close to that outermost surface where it's likely to get damaged. So long story short, reapplication is going to be necessary. It's going to be as often as once per year. And you're just going to have to get used to the fact that these labels on the cans are not going to be the experience you're likely to have, because the best you're probably going to get in most cases is 1 or 2 years before you need to do some maintenance and refinishing on a deck. Now, what happens if you go too long without reapplication? Well, most of the time when you get around to applying a fresh coat of finish, you're going to be staining and putting finish on that outermost layer of cellulose fibers that are about to fall off, about to slough off the surface. That's that lignin and wood fiber process. That's why we, and the instructions in the back of the can, hopefully, will tell you to sand an old deck before refinishing. And that's not just busy work. What we want you to do is get a fresh substrate that's going to be ready to accept and hold on to that finish. That's best practice. Let's see here. We move on to water. This is the other big problem you're going to be up against. Mother Nature built trees so that they're really, really good at sucking up water. The cellular structure is designed to move it. And you got to think about this. Deck planks are just a bunch of pieces of tree laid horizontally. And each end of a board is an open invitation for water to soak right in. So what happens? As wood takes on water, it's going to expand across its width. And that's perpendicular to the direction of the grain. And then as it dries, it shrinks back down again. So depending on your region, rainfall is probably going to be a big concern. And if you're in a really arid climate, it's less of a concern, obviously. But for a majority of the country, rainfall and water is going to be a big concern. As I mentioned, board ends are going to be the most susceptible to this expansion and shrinkage. And you can tell that they're most susceptible because the board ends is where you often see those little small cracks and checks. And more cracks mean more water absorption. And that means that wetting and drying, shrinking and expanding cycle continues and continues. And it just creeps up the edges of the boards. The same thing, by the way, happens around fastener penetrations through the deck boards, which is what has given so much rise to this hidden fastener, not just for aesthetic appeal, but also because it helps the deck boards last longer. Now, the cycle of expansion and shrinkage is going to be slower in dense decking like ipe and other tropical hardwoods than it would be in soft decking like cedar or redwood. But it will happen in all woods, and yes, that does include pressure-treated wood. This is a good time to mention that deck finishes are not designed to waterproof a board completely. They're just meant to slow the wetting and drying down. It's just sort of like they're just meant to control and reduce the expansion and contraction a bit so that the wood is less likely to develop cracks from dramatic swings in moisture content. We're essentially flattening the curve. A little relevant right now. Coating the ends of each board, which I have down here at the bottom, that's going a long way to help, because if you just coat the surface of the wood decking, the ends are still open for business. Now, before we move on, I also just want to mention that moisture level is also a factor in the growth of fungus on deck planks. Finish manufacturers typically keep this maintenance headache under control with the help of what's called mildew-side additives. But even in a perfectly sealed board, they can still foster the growth of that nice green slime on the outside layer of the finish. As long as that algae has something organic to grow on, it can grow. The finish will, the manufacturers can protect the finish itself, but they can't promise that you're never going to have growth on your deck. Okay, so those are the enemies of a deck, as I like to call them. And like I said, it's good to know what you're up against before deciding on a finish so you can help combat those real-world factors. When it comes to choosing a finish, it's important to set expectations right off the bat. So before I dive in and talk to you about oil here, I just want to say that none of these finishes are really going to give you 5, 10, 15 years of maintenance-free life. It's just not a reality. Decks are horizontal. They get walked on. They get grilled on. They're scraped by chairs and tables. All of that on top of just being a giant catch basin for rain, snow, and lots of sun. I mean, there's a lot of stuff working against it. It's just a very difficult set of circumstances. So take what you read on these cans of finish with a grain of salt. Experience will tell you to expect to recoat or refinish your wooden deck every year or two, maybe slightly less often under ideal conditions, arid, dry climates. The thing is that, Pacific Northwest gets a lot of rain. You go in the high desert and you get a lot of sun. So you might have one or either of those two enemies working against you, but those in themselves are extreme situations. So it's really, everyone is kind of in the same boat. That's why there's no single best type or brand of finish. I can't tell you that brand X is better than brand Y, or even that oil is better than water-based. There's just too many variables between environment, usage, prep work, and so forth. So what I will tell you is how to think about these based on your circumstances. And that's really about learning to decode the product labels and information. So anyway, let's get started with oil. And from there, we're going to move on to water-based and what I like to call hybrid, just to give you a picture of where we're going. Okay, so the problem here, even before we talk about oil specifically, and it's a really annoying problem, is that the marketing folks of these companies all do things their own way. There's no universal language of deck finish terms. It's not across the board, and some manufacturers are more transparent with language than others. But often you won't see oil, water, or hybrid on any of the labels you come across. In the real world, you're likely to see mention of alkyd, acrylic, or other chemical keywords. Sometimes you don't even get that clue. You just get generic wording like waterproofing wood finish or deck and siding stains. Or like I mentioned before, wood protector toner waterproofing sealant. Still my personal favorite. But knowing some of these indicator words will help you sort through the options. So I'll also give you those clues to have in shopping. If you can't or don't want to remember the keywords, there's a little trick. You can usually get close to understanding the contents of the finish by just looking at the back of the can. And I don't mean looking at the chemical makeup. I mean actually looking at where it tells you in the instructions how to clean up the finish. If whether or not it tells you soap and water cleanup or to use solvent. And so we'll dig into that too. All right, now on to oil. These obviously are the traditional option for decks. They've been around for a long time, although their composition has definitely evolved somewhat from those old linseed oil formulations that we've used decades ago. Linseed oil is still used, but it's most often combined with alkyds. And there's that word again. Alkyds are just a synthetic alternative that better resists yellowing than linseed oil does. It's also not organic, and some people will tell you that linseed oil is more likely to foster the growth of fungus. In general, oil-based finishes will penetrate wood better than water-based finishes do, and they're easier to recoat. But they do carry some pretty heavy trade-offs of higher VOCs and a cleanup process that requires solvents, mineral spirits, paint thinner. One of the things that people tend to like about oil finishes is, like I said, they're easy to reapply on an annual basis or just for doing touch-ups. You basically just have to clean the deck well and you're ready to put on a fresh coat. But you can't talk about oil-based finishes without talking about VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And traditional penetrating finishes, the reason why we talk about VOCs is that these finishes, they rely on a solvent, like I said, linseed oil, mineral spirits, to help deck planks absorb the modified oil resins and other additives. So that the solvent is like the vehicle that's soaking into the wood and bringing all those good additives with it to protect the board. The oil-based finishes still are still widely available, but less than they used to be. The push is now towards water-based finishes that contain much lower amounts of VOCs, if any at all, and then some hybrid finishes, which again we'll get into. This trend, for obvious reasons, is due in part to stricter government regulation, but it's not really nationwide. Truthfully, I don't even know what the current nationwide VOC limit is for consumer grade products such as deck stains. it sort of doesn't matter because it changes state to state. And to comply with local VOC regulations, some companies actually offer the same product in different formulations, or they sell the high VOC products only in small cans as a way to skirt the rules. So they limit, it could be limited based on the quantity of the can. So by selling it as a quart instead of a gallon, they can have a higher VOC content. So you might have friends in different states that have different products than you do. It might have the same product with it might be the product with the same label. But if you go onto the back and look by the barcode, you'll see that one is water-based and one's oil-based. These paint companies, the finish companies, have had to adapt to this. And so they often have geo-targeted products for different parts of the country because this varies so widely. Now let's talk about the words you should look for when you're looking for an oil-based finish. Obviously, first and foremost is oil. If it says oil, you're golden. But that word tends to have been eliminated as years have gone on, or at least reduced heavily, I guess, because it scares some people for cleanup or VOCs and the environment. So you might also see words like linseed, which I mentioned, or alkyd. Again, if you're not sure, check the cleanup instructions. If it tells you to use a solvent like mineral spirits or paint thinner, you can bet that what you're looking at is an oil-based product. Okay, let's go over water-based. These products, which I would say have gained popularity in maybe the last 10 plus years, are thicker and they're almost paint-like. And you can see the difference if I go back to the oil. You see here in the oil-based photo, it's pretty runny. I mean, if people have used this before. It's a very runny, easy to apply finish, and that's what makes it so easy to penetrate. When you get into water-based, it's thicker. It's more like a paint. The biggest perk that these water-based paints can offer is that they clean up with soap and water rather than solvents. And because they're not solvent-based, they typically don't have the same high VOC levels or strong odors that you're going to get with oil-based finishes, which makes them a lot more user-friendly. Obviously, less environmental concerns. But in addition to that, acrylic and latex, which are two words for water-based, they actually retain their color better than oil formulas. I wouldn't consider that to be universally applicable criteria because the world of paints and finishes is really broad and things change quickly. But that is something to keep in mind, that if you did an apples to apples comparison, you may see that water-based stains are going to hold kind of vibrant colors and keep them brighter longer than an oil-based stain will. But like I said, the thicker consistency of these water-based products means that they're not going to absorb into the wood as easily. And once you have a coat of water-based finish on a deck, prepping that deck for another future refinishing as you need it a year or two down the line becomes harder. It's not as easy as just touching it up with oil. Then lastly, we have what I would refer to as hybrid products. This is sort of an effort to combine the best parts of oil-based finish with the best parts of water-based finish. You can see here on the little chart, we don't really have a con section. There's not a huge strong con in this category because this is really supposed to be the Goldilocks of finishes. It's supposed to look at the market and say, here's what you like about water-based and you don't like, here's what you like about oil-based and don't like, and we made this product for you that solves some of those problems. You might see some confusing terminology with the hybrid thing. It sounds counterintuitive, but what you're doing is they're combining oil and water essentially. So you get that high color retention, the reduced VOCs, and that easy cleanup. But the terminology is not going to likely say hybrid. It's probably going to say something like waterborne modified, oil latex, acrylic oil, or you see here water reducible, which is kind of the more technical term for it. And by the way, let's look back real quick here. You notice again the viscosity of it. So we have very thin, very thick, and somewhere in between. So again, this is sort of like the Goldilocks choice. Now, let's talk about the wrong slide here. Let's talk about pigments. Now, you're going to, after you figure out the formula, you can think about pigment, and this is the color, essentially, and the opacity of that color. The terminology and the number of options you're going to see is going to vary slightly from brand to brand. Deck finishes are typically available in 4 levels: clear, toner, semi-solid, sometimes semi-transparent, and solid. But that, like I said, can vary. Some companies don't have all 4 types. Some focus just on making a clear or a toner. But often, more nowadays, you're going to pick a brand and then be able to choose how opaque it is. And that's important because the difference in the amount of pigment is that the pigment is what provides protection against UV damage. Let's start our talk at solid here, which is the best protection against UV. And so if you had all other factors being equal, these solid stains are going to last the longest. They're also a good choice if you need to conceal a really weathered deck. That's made them really popular for people who are breathing new life into an old, worn out, pressure treated deck. The pigments don't absorb into wood as well, though, as other more translucent finishes. So these stains are sort of like a coat of paint. They sort of just sit on top of the surface of the wood, and that can create a lot of potential drawbacks. First, the stain is really vulnerable to wear and tear from foot traffic and patio furniture, for obvious reasons. I mean, if you soak finish into a wood and then you walk on it, that finish is going to be more protected. If you paint a coating on top of wood, now the only thing you're walking on is that coating. Eventually, you're going to wear down to the wood. So that's the first drawback there. The second is that the grain and the color of the underlying wood are going to be obscured by this, obviously. Sometimes that's a good thing. If you wanted to save some money on the decking choice, you can often make it look pretty good with a solid pigment stain. Again, if you have a really worn out deck, this becomes an attractive option. But not so great if you spent a lot of money and got nice quarter sawn pressure treated decking or cedar or something like that you wanted to see that nice wood grain. This will look like you painted it. And finally, if you get water below the finish of these solid finishes, either from the top side, like through a fastener hole, or from being drawn up from below due to poor underdeck drainage or a gutter downspout dumping water right underneath your deck that might be grade level, you're going to have a higher likelihood that these solid finishes are going to peel. They kind of, like I said, they kind of tend to act like paint. They're a little bit different, but it's similar enough that kind of comparison holds water. Pun intended, I guess. Next, you have the semi category, and for this, we can kind of we can lump together semi-solid and semi-transparents. Like I said, some companies offer both. Some offer just one or the other. In general, semi-solids and semi-transparents are going to offer more color options than toners, which we'll get to next, but less protection than the solids that we just talked about. That said, they're the best protection you can get while still being able to see some of that wood grain coming through. And this would probably be like the Goldilocks version of pigments. You get some protection and you get some color, but you also get to see that wood grain through. We have our example here is red. Obviously, this is just for purposes of showing you the difference between things. And these are in an endless array of colors, so you can get something that looks a little closer to the species of wood you're trying to match or trying to represent. The finishes, these semi finishes might also be a good choice if you're trying to renew a weathered deck that doesn't have major imperfections. One that's maybe a few years old that's just needs a pretty good reboot, but isn't so horrible that you want to just cover up everything going on underneath. Moving on from the semi category, you're going to find what are called toners. And these are, unlike the organic absorbers and stabilizers that you're going to see in a clear finish, which we'll get to next, these toner finishes they contain inorganic pigments. And what these are, and often they're go by several names, but they're often called transoxide. That's kind of the most commonly seen name, and it's sometimes listed on the can. These are like they're extremely finely ground inorganic pigments that give a little bit of color to the finish, but they're so finely ground that visible light essentially goes around them. So they look clear. They'll make it a little ambery. That's the little bit of color. But if you were to go microscopically, what looks like sort of a semi-clear amberish finish actually has these little floating particles that are acting as little deflectors to bounce the UV light off. So kind of the plus here is that, yes, you get to see a lot of that natural color and grain of the wood, but it's not going to be a clear coat if that's what you're expecting, which in some ways, for some reasons is a good thing. Before I move on, I should tell you that typically the colors in this category, we do have a red example here, but typically they're going to be limited to browns and reds. These are earth tone kind of things, hence the name toner. One cool thing here is that you can match these stains to the color of the wood so that they appear nearly clear, even when they're not really clear. So if you have a cedar deck and you buy a cedar toner, you can kind of give it the look of a clear coat by choosing the right stain up front, if that makes sense. So let's talk about clear finishes. We've heard of products called water seal, that kind of thing. These, I think you can safely break them into two categories. We have sort of the low end clear finishes. These are typically water clear, or they can sometimes be milky white, that you'll brush on and they'll be milky white or almost bluish tinged, and then they dry clear. These will not offer any UV protection typically. This is essentially like putting a clear coat on that does nothing but make water bead up for a little while. And these will typically have the shortest life for when you compare deck finishes. There are also clear finishes that tend a little bit more towards an amber color, which you'll see here. It's a pretty subtle difference. It looks a little bit more obvious in person than it does in this photo. The ones that have this amber tone to them, they typically contain organic, those are some more of those UV absorbers and stabilizers. But because these are a little different than toner, and they're gonna break down a little faster. So comparing this to a toner, this is going to be an option that you're going to have to touch up more frequently. This is going to become an annual problem that you're going to have to recoat. That's just the trade-off for being able to see the wood grain for this kind of a clear coat finish. Again, you can match these to the color. There's some matching available, some color option available, so you can make it look more natural. I don't have a slide for this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about pricing. Just one quick word. When it comes to paints and finishes, people think that price often can be an indicator of quality. And to a certain extent, that is true because you're talking about performance being tied to what additives are included in the paint or the stain. And more additives do cost more money. But you should be careful of applying this rule of thumb across multiple brands, like if you're comparing brand X and brand Y, because it tends to apply more when comparing products from the same company. Some companies will have kind of a baseline product, a premium product, and there the price difference really is one is outperforming the other in terms of what you're going to get from it. Let's see here. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and fire them into that Q&A section. And let's see. Tom McKenna writes, when do you need to strip versus just recoat? It's a good question. Typically when you have those solid waterborne stains, those are going to be ones that you need to remove completely before you can put another coat on. That answers the question, assuming that you mean when can I just reapply over the existing finish. In those cases, you can use oil to reapply over an existing finish. But how to know when you need to recoat a deck is you're going to be looking for it to kind of look like the color's gone dull and kind of a hazy, scuffed up look. That's usually an indication that it's time to put on a fresh coat. And usually what that involves is that you would clean the deck really well. They make wood cleaners and brighteners. You would use that kind of a product, usually a very light setting on a pressure washer to clean everything off. A stiff bristled brush works really well to help get in there and remove all the dirt and grime, spray all that off. And then you're going to come back through and you're going to put a new coat of finish on top. But the short answer is you're going to know when you need to strip versus just adding more, because it's going to be in such bad shape that it will be lifting off. You're going to be looking for that adhesion. It's sort of the same rules that you would apply for finishing a piece of furniture or painting your house. If there's a really good bond between that finish and the surface that you can't just easily flake off, then you may be able to just feather the edges and put on a solid stain or the same color stain. But typically, when it's gotten really bad, if you haven't kept up with the maintenance, which is the typical problem, it becomes an issue where you have to just strip it all the way off. Sometimes a floor sander honestly works well there. I've done that in the past, where you can go rent one of those 4-pad sanders and just ride it all along the surface of the deck and just clean everything off with some coarse grit sandpaper. I have another question here. Are some finishes only compatible with specific types of wood? I wouldn't worry about this too much. I mean, I would be very surprised if you got a tropical Brazilian hardwood and then you wanted to put a solid colored stain over it. Typically, penetrating oils are used for those situations. But again, you have to make a decision. Are you okay with your wood just kind of turning gray and looking weathered, which is, a look that doesn't necessarily bother some people? Or do you want to have that nice dark brown, rich look all year round? And that's going to mean that you need to apply that penetrating oil on that hardwood decking frequently, annually, because otherwise it's going to kind of get that thirsty look. It's going to look like it's starved of finish and you need to put some more on. Another typical thing that we get questions about a lot is whether to install deck boards bark side up or bark side down when thinking about the longevity of a deck. And it's a little bit of a tangent here, but I think it's important to this because it ties into under deck ventilation. It's a complicated question of which side should face up on deck boards, and you'll get different answers from different people. The truth of what's going on is you can put the board either way. It doesn't really matter because it's got more airflow on the top than it does on the bottom. And so what's happening is that deck board, which is held down with 2 fasteners into each joist, as the wood soaks up water, it's going to expand, right? Like we talked about. And between those 2 fasteners, it's going to push and compress. And the wood outside of the fasteners is going to tend to kind of, as it dries out, it's going to kind of expand back, and it's going to end up with this cup shape. You may have seen this with like a sheet of plywood. If you throw a sheet of plywood down in the ground, it's going to curl like a potato chip because the bottom of it stays kind of wet from the moisture coming out of the ground, and the top dries in the sun and it curls up. The top is drying more than the bottom. The top shrinks, bottom stays expanded, it curls like a potato chip. It's a little more complicated with a deck board because of those fasteners holding it and what's going on between the fasteners versus outside of the fasteners. But the effect is the same. The thing that's important is not whether the deck boards are bark side up or bark side down. What you want is good airflow below the deck. So again, I mentioned no gutter downspouts pouring water under your deck. You don't want to have drainage from one part of your yard running down under your deck before it goes, into the woods. You want to make sure you don't have grass and weeds and dirt. You want to make sure you have a couple of feet of separation. What we worry about too with water coming up out of the ground and keeping the underside of your deck relatively wet is that what we want to do is add basically a capillary break is what we refer to it as. So the way water moves is it moves from big to small. So as long as the water is able to absorb into a finer surface, so for instance, from gravel to sand, it will continue to move. If you flip that around and you have sand with gravel on top, it can't move from the sand into the gravel. So that's why you see people put down a layer of gravel as that last layer underneath the deck. It prevents water from wicking up any farther than ground level. So that's a great thing you can do if you're having trouble with your boards soaking up water from underneath, is spread a layer of gravel under there, in addition to addressing all the drainage concerns. Looks like Dale had a similar question. His mahogany deck was not coated on all sides before being put down. How bad is this, being finished on only one side? It's not bad. It's completely typical. For all the reasons I just talked about, it's as long as you have good ventilation under there, you should be fine. I don't see any reason why you couldn't finish it on all sides before putting it down. It would give you a chance to really coat those board ends before putting them in place. So yeah, no problem there. Any other questions you guys have? Go ahead and fire them off. Do larger stones under a deck create the same capillary break as gravel? Larger stones. Yes, they should. Like I said, as long as it's moving from small to large. That when you say larger stones, the only thing I worry about is that if it's larger stones with a lot of small stones in between them, like you would have with a concrete mix, then no, it's not going to help you. If you had sand, then 3/4 inch gravel, or just dirt, and then 1 inch or 2 inch stones in a big thick pile, then yes, that's going to work the same way that gravel would. Dale asked, how about number of coats? That you have to really go manufacturer to manufacturer for that. In a lot of cases, it can be a 1-coat job for something like an oil. Other times they might ask you to apply more than 1 coat. These are all so widely varying depending on the type you choose, the opacity of it, et cetera, et cetera. You can't make a blanket statement about how to apply these finishes. In these cases, I refer to a finisher, Peter Gedries, that we like to work with at Fine Homebuilding, who says, when in doubt, read the instructions. If nobody else has any other questions, I guess we'll wrap it up. And like I said, this is going to be available on our website. So we will follow up with you guys via email and send you a link to it. And we do appreciate you guys tuning in, and we hope you'll join us for the next expert sessions here at Fine Homebuilding. Feel free to get in touch. Let us know what you think. Spread the word. Share it with your friends. And thanks for tuning in.